When somebody has a near-death experience, what they tell us is, well, there are no words for this, right? There are no words. This is beyond the power of language to describe, right? And they also say, and there was no time passed. I saw everything I'd ever done, but no time passed. And also, I was not in space. This was not in a spatial dimension. But the only way I have of explaining it to you is I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I came back to my body and returned to life. Now that's a travel mirror. Now think about it for a minute. We get the meaning of a travel narrative comes from the concepts of space and time.
Yeah.
That's nonsense, right? But it creates a very vivid image of that very movement in your mind. That's what we have with near-death experiences.
Hey everyone, welcome back to First Contact. I've got another very exciting episode for you on the topic of near-death experiences. Now, this guest that we have on today probably requires very, very little introduction because if you heard the term NDE, you've probably come across Dr. Raymond Moody, who is what I would consider the world's leading expert in all things near-death experience. Having gone through some of my studies recently in consciousness studies as well, we've actually studied his work in our textbooks. And so the name Dr. Raymond Moody comes up quite a lot in the topic of NDEs. So if you don't know who he is a leading authority, the author of several books, including the seminal Life After Life, the founder of the Life After Life Institute, and Dr. Moody has lectured on the topic throughout the world. He's a counselor in a private practice. He received his medical degree from the College of Georgia and his PhD from the University of Virginia. And he's appeared on many different programs and recently has also written a book with Paul Perry, which we can talk about in the show as well. So welcome to First Contact, Raymond. It's beautiful.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you so much. And give my greetings to all the folks at your institute as well.
Absolutely. We have so much fun studying this. And I have to tell you to start with, I've been into NDEs before it was trendy, before all the YouTube videos and channels were out talking about it, because my mom had a near-death experience when I was a child. And so we used to very quietly in our home talk about this topic. But back then, I'm sure you went through this in the earlier years, is it was very taboo. Not everybody would be willing to discuss it, or they would think it's a hallucination, or they would not take it seriously, or they would think it was demonic. Some of the religious people would think it was demonic. And so there was a lot around the stigma of being able to even discuss the topic. And so we used to talk about it just very quietly around our family table while eating dinner. And we were told not to ever say anything, not to tell our friends, not to discuss it even with our extended family. So for many, many years, this experience was a family secret. And so now, after all these years, it's become, fairly normalized. We're talking 30 years down the track or more. It's become fairly normalized, and people like yourself have now spent so many decades researching this. And so I'm really excited to dive into some of the hopefully deeper aspects of near-death experience, what it is, how it works, the conclusions you've come to. And one thing that I found really interesting about what you've said is you pretty much are prepared to answer the question of what happens when we die. So why don't we start there? Talk us what you have actually discovered about this.
Well, I think first of all, I should say that it's just too bad that people at one point thought of this as something stigmatized, because in reality, the whole Western way of thinking, the rational process, originated with people who were fascinated by these near-death experiences. The way I got interested in it was at age 18. I was intending to be an astronomy major, but at the University of Virginia, my first year, I took a course on Plato, and I immediately decided to be a philosophy major. because what Plato's famous Republic is about a near-death experience. The Republic culminates in this experience that a warrior had when he was believed dead on the battlefield, but revived and told his colleagues about this getting out of his body and going into another world. And I had no idea at age 18 that anybody took the notion of an afterlife seriously. I really didn't know. I was not raised religious. And I just thought that it was a joke or like a cartoon premise. And suddenly I woke up that my hero, Plato, took this seriously. And so I asked my professor about this, and he said, yeah, the Greek philosophers knew of cases where people had apparently died but been revived and had these experiences. And a little before Plato, Democritus, who had figured out that things are made of atoms, had written about this. And he said, just like the neurophysiologists tell us today, he said, he said, there's no such thing as a moment of death, that this results from the residual biological activity in the body even after the body appears dead. So, and that was my entree to it, but it never occurred to me that it might be pertaining to modern world. And but 3 years later, I met Dr. George Ritchie, who was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia, who had such an experience. And so I learned about that. I learned about another one when I became a philosophy professor in 1969. I started hearing this from my students. And by the time I got to medical school in 1972, I had quite a lot of cases of this. So my publisher asked me to write a book, and that's how it was. Why did it suddenly change like that? Well, I think people have always known about these things, but up until the 1960s, this was an extraordinarily rare event. And what happened was in the 60s and 70s, with the advent of cardiopulmonary resuscitation, that changed it just very quickly. And something that was once a very extraordinarily rare event became a daily event. And that's what happened. And with it, it's you can't get away from this anymore. It's people are getting resuscitated all the time, and a high percentage of them have these experiences. So every day, a huge mass of people joined the group of folks who, from their point of view, been to the other side.
That's incredible. And to be fair, I never actually considered the role of resuscitation in the increase of these occurrences, because I guess, I mean, it makes sense when you put it like that, because of course, when more people are going and having the opportunity to come back because
That's right.
their body is being resuscitated, that does make a lot of sense. And
Yeah.
also I wonder, I have this belief, maybe you sit with me on this, Raymond, is like everything happens by design, like everything in this universe, including the introduction of technologies, there is some form of grand design in order to the way that the universe is structured. And I can see how the introduction of resuscitation technology is also playing a role in our human evolution, because it's allowing us to understand who we really are as human beings and what happens on the other side. And it's really beautiful that we're starting to now take this topic more seriously from a research perspective, so that we really can answer the question of what does happen. Do we cross over and go somewhere? Is there a soul? Is there something on the other side where life continues on? And of course, you're the best person to answer that question. So,
well, I think I may be, because being a logician, I understand why it's, you hear all the time people saying scientific evidence of life after death. That is just simply not the case. And parapsychologists who think of it that way, these are my dear friends. They're sweet, sweet people. But in terms of their thinking process, they're kind of captivated by scientism, that this has got to be a scientific question. In reality, in the real world, the question of life after death is probably, in my opinion, the most important question. And maybe perhaps for that reason, it is not yet a scientific question. And the reason is that there is no clear procedure or process by which you could confirm it or disconfirm it. See, but go back in your mind, Eesha, to the year 1915 and be a very, very informed and educated person of the year 1915. Okay. And now listen to the following sentence. All four of Ethel's grandparents perished and were lost in a shipwreck long before her mother and father were born. In 1915, that's totally unintelligible, right? It's nonsense. Now add the knowledge of the role of DNA and heredity, gene splicing, gene editing, cloning, and you have a scenario that makes it intelligible. It hasn't happened yet, but we can imagine in an intelligible sequence of events how it could. And where we are right now is with the afterlife question is that we're right there in the middle of this. It's something that in the real world has been unintelligible for, but with the advent of these kinds of experiences, it is now we have a way of well, go back to 100 years ago and somebody says, I got out of a tunnel, I got out of my body and went through a tunnel into the light. What are they talking about? Now it's becoming it's synced into the public perception in a way. And it sounds so goofy and a little bit paranoid to be talking about the things you were talking about, the design and the universe and such. And I understand why that is such a very conceptually difficult thing to imagine. And yet, in the course of my life, Eesha, things have happened. For example, this Dr. George Ritchie, who was the first living person I ever knew who had a near-death experience. He was from Richmond, Virginia, okay? And my mother and father were from Porterdale, Georgia. And I met George Ritchie in 1965 at the University of Virginia. And his experience, which changed my life as well as his, took place at Camp Barkley, Texas in December 1943, when George was a recruit in the Army. And he went to Camp Barkley, Texas for his basic training, and he developed double lobar pneumonia and was dead for 9 minutes, according to the wonderful physician who took care of him, Dr. Francie. And so George had this amazing experience, which I heard in 1965 and changed my life, set me off on this path of investigating all these cases. And I wrote my book in August of 1974. It was published in November of 1975. And to my astonishment, it quickly became a worldwide bestseller. Okay, now November of 1975, it was published. January of 1976, 2 months later, I graduated from medical school. And I was a medical student in Georgia. But I had been to UVA for my undergraduate and my graduate programs. So I decided to go back to Charlottesville to do my psychiatry residency. So in March of 1976, I went up there and I did my interviews, and I talked to George Ritchie for a while there. Next day, came back to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived. They were taking care of my kids. And I very casually mentioned that the day before I'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, that it inspired me in this work. And by then, my dad had heard a tape of George Ritchie's experience. And I swear to God, my dad said the following words: George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. You know, I was there, and so were you. My mom and dad had moved to Camp Berkeley in early September 1943. I was conceived in late September. George's experience was December 20th, roughly. And my parents moved away from Camp Berkeley on December 29th. So I was there in utero when this experience happened that changed my life, and repeatedly. George Ritchie just materialized in my life in the most amazing ways. And just, I mean, it's just what I'm getting at is that really, if you're reflective, it is hard to kind of think your way out of what you were talking about, that there is some kind of level above this that is kind of, and it seems to me to have something to do with narrative. You were talking about the soul. You mentioned the soul. Well, you mentioned what I think about the soul. I don't think there's any such thing as a soul, okay? Because, and let me explain, that is a philosophical construct. It came ultimately from Pythagoras and then was developed by Plato, the notion of the immaterial mortal soul. This is very counterintuitive to Christians, but you know, if they just look this up in the history books, they'd see it's the Christians took their theology of the afterlife from Plato's Phaedo. That's the historical reality. And that's where this notion of the immaterial immortal soul came. Well, you could be burned at the stake after, you know, after the Christians got started for questioning that, right? So, you know, and this pretty much, they terrorized every thinker until about 1500 or so. And once things got, you know, loosening up a little bit, Thomas Hobbes pointed out, well, the notion of an immaterial, immortal soul, it doesn't make any sense. It's unintelligible, right? And so, you know, people got to thinking, and Locke, John Locke, who had a lot to do with the formation of the American Constitution, was thinking, and he said, well, you know, he saw Hobbes's point, and then he said, well, what consists of what our inner self consists of is our consciousness and our memories. That's a different point of view from the soul, see, which is a substance. Then David Hume, the great skeptic, came along a few decades later and he said, when I look inside of myself, I don't see anything that's permanent. It's always just the impression of the moment, which is what a lot of psychologists are telling us these days. It's an illusion, right? Well, you know, I have a right to have an opinion, I guess, and where I've come to on this, it came from, I had a wonderful year working in a geriatrics clinic for people who couldn't be seen at the front door of the mental health clinic because they were the mayor or the chief of police or the international celebrity, right? And so in a little town, you got to have some arrangement. And I was the oldest resident and known for my book. So I was it. And constantly during that year, Eesha, I heard people, and these were very, very reflective, brilliant people. Some of them you know, yeah, they're just very famous. And so repeatedly I heard this, Raymond, like the older I get, more when I look back at my life, I get this uncanny feeling that it's been a movie or a script or a play or a novel or a story. They would use different words, but the idea is, and so that's where I've come to think of it. What we're in is kind of like movies, is the way. And now, if a logician is listening to this, they'll say, "Oh, Raymond Moody just slipped into a logical error," because, you know, what the argument would be is, well, what Raymond Moody is saying is that the life is like the theater, right? He's taking one aspect of human life and projecting out into the universe as a model of the whole. All right. And that would be literalizing a metaphor, which is a logical fallacy. And I get that, but I'm saying no, it didn't happen that way. It happened the other way. I think the reason why we have the theater is that people like Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides were the public intellectuals of their era. And so they were thinkers, and, they were getting, oh my God, it's so that, there's this has this dramatical structure. And so what sparked it was Thespis one day, for reasons unknown, stepped forward from the chorus, which was a tradition there in Athens. They would sing the old the old stories and myths and so on. And when Thespis spoke his own lines, it created the sensation. Now, we all know about the Greeks, and what everybody knows about the Greeks is pretty much their essence, and that is competition, right? Everybody knows about the Olympic Games. Well, that's what the Greeks are all about, competition, right? And so, what was the first response when they created this sensation? Let's have a contest. Aristotle, who had practically no sense of humor, wrote this essay about trying to figure out what kinds of things you couldn't decide by contest. So that's how, and so it just created this sensation. And the first winner was Aeschylus and Sophocles, Euripides. 50 years it took for the theater to become a profession. What I think that plainly means is that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides had just figured out from their life experience what my patients told me, that the older you get, this looks more like a story. And so they could level out a flat place down there and act it out. I remember having that sensation one time when I saw the Orpheus movie. It was the Book of Life, a Disney animated thing, but it was Orpheus was the story. And I remember the movie had the whole life of this Mexican man, all right? And so I remember stepping out of the theater, and 2 hours had passed. And I remember, oh my God, we saw that man's entire life unfold in a 2-hour segment. See, that's one thing drama can do. It can condense. Just like at the end of life, people say that your story gets reviewed. It's broken into little pieces and it's spread around you in a hologram. And there's no time. And you see everything you've ever done in your life from the point of view of the other characters.
Like a movie.
And,
so
yeah.
It makes sense how people get that.
Yeah. So I think David Hume was, he was really a terrific skeptic. And, even he died in 1776, born in 1711, died in 1776. And Hume was, he wouldn't let his essay on the afterlife be published until after he was dead. So, even though they had to put the stakes away by then, they could still harm you. So, but in his skeptical essay about the afterlife, he gave a very, very severe criticism of why it can't be or why we can't know. But he also said in that essay, he said that he felt that the only kind of afterlife that a philosophical person could entertain would be reincarnation. And he didn't say why, but I figured, see, Hume was more famous as a historian. And historians understand the essential role of narrative in human life, right? So, in the reincarnation is the most story-like form of the afterlife, right? Yeah, I was born in India and I lived a life as a shepherd, it's a story, right? But anyway, that's speculation on my part, but I think I'm probably right. But my point being that you're right, that this thing we're in, the older you get, the more you see that it doesn't really have the structure that the physicalist worldview wants to. I've never been able to be a physicalist. Now, I love science. I almost majored in astronomy, still love astronomy. I love science. But in terms of this whole sphere of things we're in, it's, I cannot I cannot make the leap to physicalism. Most people do without reflection, because I put a Coke bottle on my desk this morning. Then I took an hour walk. I came back, the Coke bottle was still there. Most people infer, well, the Coke bottle is existing. I just baloney. You can't make that inference. So I don't know whether there is a physical world as it's portrayed,
Well,
but
I
I kind
some
I
theory.
kind of figure it's not real. I don't think so. Uh-uh.
Yeah, and I think some of the more modern philosophies, I mean, I'm, as of recently, a huge fan of analytical idealism, which I've also come across in my studies. And I find that it has such a more grounded framework to make sense of the world around us, and it's something that when I heard about it, it almost put into words and into a framework what I'd already known and what I'd already believed to be true. Like there's this field of consciousness, and the physical experience is the temporary part of that. Having also spoken to many people who've had near-death experiences, including my mom and other people I've interviewed on the First Contact podcast as well, one thing that is common across all of that, it's like they close their eyes, or whatever happens, whatever triggers them moving,
Yeah,
they close their eyes, but it's like they continue to exist. They continue to exist outside of the body. So what is that? Like, what is that thing? I mean, you've said it's not a soul, which I think still it doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I assume that the non-physical aspect of it is related to some sort of soul type of energy, or consciousness, if you want to call it consciousness. But there is something there that continues to go on even after the heartbeat has stopped, or even after the eyesight has gone, or somebody's gone into a state of almost being in a coma, or they fainted or something like that, but the consciousness continues. And so what
yeah.
is that? Where does it go, and how can we learn more about that?
I wish I knew, but I tell you the truth. I'm so glad I majored in philosophy and that I was a philosophy professor, because, that's really that's philosophy is the discipline, whether they want it or not. But the philosophy is the discipline to which the question of life after life belongs. And people who think otherwise are victims of a social movement called scientism. And scientism, by the way, is a very widespread, although often unconscious, doctrine that people have, that scientific method is the only rational means of securing truth. Well, I used to teach epistemology, which is theory of knowledge, and I would start in my class every semester. I taught epistemology. The first couple of days, I'd say, "Hey, kids, what do you think knowledge is?" Right? Well, from my experience, what people say is they'll come up with, well, science, knowledge is science, right? Well, what do you mean exactly? Eventually, they come up with scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge. And so I write that up on the board. Is that what you think? Even the nutty fundamentalist religious kids will say, yeah, that's what I think, right? But it's so then I say, I write that on the board. Scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge. And I draw a rectangle about it, and I point to it and I say, well, how do you know that? Now think about it for a minute. There's two possible answers they could give. They could say scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge. And I know that by the scientific method is not very bright. That's called reasoning in a circle, all right? Assuming what you set out to prove. or But the other answer would be scientific method is the only rational means of securing knowledge, and I know that by philosophy or history or the law, and that's a self-contradiction. So, scientism is something that people take on unconsciously without ever thinking it through. But the reality is, science is one among numerous different rational means of securing knowledge. And the way that the question of life after death in 2025 is not yet a scientific question. That is the reality of it. But you and I both know there are millions of people who are taken up in this illusion. But and they do it for fear, Eesha. But if they would just not surrender their analytic minds and would follow along, as Plato said, a long and remote chain of reasoning, you could come up to realize, yeah, there is a way to do this. And I have a forthcoming book. It's called Swan Song. And the subtitle of it is A New Logic for Proof of an Afterlife. The real difficulty, see, is that most of the people who are interested in the kind of things you and I do, what they want to hear is stories. You know, they just want to hear wonderful, inspiring stories. And as soon as you start talking about concepts, their eyes roll up, right? Plato pointed out that one of the biggest problems in rational proof of an afterlife is what he called the narrative concept problem. Well, that's my word, but that was his problem. And that is that it's wonderful there's got to be some kind of story, because the notion of an afterlife is rather obscure. So there's got to be a story element to bring it to your attention, right? And because it's a self-contradiction to say there is life after death. Think about it. Look up the words in the dictionary. What you're saying when you say there is life after death is there is life after the final irreversible cessation of life is nonsense. But you can get out of this. But you can't be assured or get to the confidence that there's an afterlife, at least rationally, by listening to lots and lots of stories. You've got to have some concepts to nail it down to. And as of about August, people are going to have it. Because in this book, I'm asking people to refute me, by the way, because, I've never been able to understand people, Eesha, who want to subscribe to an ideology or want things to be a certain way. I want to know what is, it strikes me that people who just kind of think they want to think there's an afterlife or want it to be, then they come up with some kind of flimsy supportive so-called reasons to get to that, but it's self-deception, which is why they are never satisfied, right? They want more stories. But if you think through a logical process, you can reach a point where you can realize, oh my God, that there is a way to find this out. But I'm just really looking forward to seeing what happens when this comes out, because
Well,
I
could you
say,
give us a little sneak preview of that? Just give us.
yeah, it's called a Swan Song. It's coming out in August, and I'd love to send you a copy of it when it get ready. So just figure it. You let me know how to do it.
Yeah, sure. I'd love that. But could you tell us right now just some of the key points that you're going to be
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
book?
People who are rational have always pointed out that the whole point about the afterlife has been that it's unknowable, right? That there's no way, it's unfathomable or unknowable. But there've been a lot of different kinds of things in life that have been regarded as unknowable. Like if you go back to the early 1800s, clouds were the symbol of the unknowable. They were just ephemeral, always moving, the opposite of knowledge. And it was the symbol of the unintelligible and the ephemeral. So the notion of knowledge of clouds would be a self-contradiction. Then came along Luke Howard, who and his business travel, looking out the window of the carriage, right? Oh my God, there's different types of them. They're the big puffy cottony ones, the feather-like ones, the stratified ones, the ones high up. And so he published a paper on that, and it created a sensation, because anybody who went out in this yard and looked would say he's right. It was entirely the symbolism of clouds as something unknowable, which kept them from knowing. We're in the same way now with the afterlife. And it had, because the real deal, see, is that, as the great philosophers have pointed out, see, is that really of course, when we say life after death, We have good feelings and we may have images coming into our mind, right? But in reality, there's no intelligible meaning to the words, right? And like they say, well, I don't mean life after, I'm talking about the life beyond or the other side. None of those phrases have any cognitive meaning. But now we have a way out of it. And basically, what I've learned how to do is to reformat the mind so that when subsequently somebody has a near death experience, they will be able to tell us about it in a whole new way. Now, why does that make a difference? Well, if you go back to 1820, people thought that it was utterly unknowable the distance to the fixed stars. People say we never will know how far it is out to, the stars. And then, and by about 1838, the measurements were getting close enough, accurate enough, that knowing that it's 186 million miles across the Earth's orbit around the sun, you can make the observation here of the angle to nearby stars, then wait exactly 6 months, measure the angle again, and there'll be a tiny difference, right? And that's parallax. What I've created is I've opened parallax on life after death. I've been teaching this new method of thinking about a lot of different things, but one of the things that you can think about more clearly with this is the notion of an afterlife. I've worked out is a logic of how you think about things that are unintelligible. And I knew full well that eventually somebody who had been through one of my seminars would have a near-death experience. And I knew that, well, let me explain why I knew this. When somebody has a near-death experience, what they tell us is, well, there are no words for this, right? There are no words. This is beyond the power of language to describe, right? And they also say, and there was no time passed. I saw everything I'd ever done, but no time passed. And also, I was not in space. This was not in a spatial dimension. But the only way I have of explaining it to you is I got out of my body. I went through a tunnel into a light. I met my deceased relatives. I saw my life pass in review. I came back to my body and returned to life. Now, that's a travel narrative. Now, think about it for a minute. We get the meaning of a travel narrative comes from the concepts of space and time.
Yeah.
Well, when Lincoln was president, there was a very solemn state ceremony. I forgot what it was, but everybody was gathered around this very solemn occasion, right? And Lincoln's part called for him to mount a horse and to lead a procession away from the city, right? But when Lincoln got up on the horse lifted its own back hoof up and got it caught in the stirrup. So the horse was leaping around and everybody was shocked into silence, embarrassed for poor Mr. Lincoln. It's like, but Lincoln just looked down at the horse and said, well, if you're getting on, I'm getting off. And, everybody just dissolved into laughter. Well, if you think about it, the notion that a horse could get on its own back by putting a hoof and climbing board, that's nonsense, right? But it creates a very vivid image of that very movement in your mind. That's what we have with near-death experiences. Now, somebody who already knows about the logic of how you think about things that are unintelligible, see? One more thing I need to say. Somebody can lapse into nonsense from delirium. For example, when I had patients, delirious, they're not making any sense, or schizophrenics, or you can talk nonsense because you're ill, right? Or you can talk nonsense involuntarily just by accident or inadvertently. For example, like the coach says, you guys pair up in threes. All right, now that's nonsense, right?
Right.
But if you went to the coach and said, just a minute, pair up means two, he would get it, being in a clear state of mind. But somebody delirious is not going to be able to do that if you correct them. right? Now, I knew all along that somebody would come along who had taken my seminar, would have a near-death experience, and they would be forced to talk about it in a different way because they would know that the point of it, to narrate it as a travel narrative, would be nonsense. See what I'm talking about? So it happened. There's this wonderful man, and he is beyond brilliant. This guy was, he worked with Bell of the Bell Throne, a brilliant scientist, also a renowned sculptor. Okay. And he called me after attending one of my seminars a couple of years later. He called me and he said, Raymond, he said, he developed H1N1. He was in the hospital for 60 days. He lost his leg to gangrene. He had 3 cardiac arrests. And he called me and he was trying, his voice was very weak. He had just out of the hospital. He said, Raymond, he was telling me about his illness. And in the midst of this, it changed tone. He said, and Raymond, he said, when I was over there, he said, my mind went back to the seminar and I saw that what you're saying is true. You can't comprehend how that world is connected to this world, as he said, unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. So what we have now here is we have opened parallax on the afterlife. We have thousands and thousands of reports from given through Aristotelian logic, which makes it a travel narrative. But when somebody goes in and they know this, then they're going to alter their account to make it intelligible, right?
So
And so that's happening.
what is the new?
Well,
If it's not travel, how else would you describe that experience?
well, see, that's why I can't wait to know, because there's a lot of people out there. I mean, eventually there's going to be more people who are, who already know how to think about the unintelligible and going to have this experience. I guarantee you. Yeah.
Well, I would put it in the frame of like multidimensional understanding, and this comes from a lot of the work I've done on the ET side of things, ufology side of things, looking at multidimensional space, time, space, however you want to put that. And it's this idea that consciousness exists beyond the physicality. And so beyond the physicality, it's not even so much about travel as it is like you've just tapped into a different state of reality. And maybe through your research, you have something you can input on this. I do know that from things like filter theories of consciousness and transcendent mind theory, they say that what you're really doing is you're experiencing more of that experience simply because your brain's not filtering the stuff out anymore. So it's not like you're traveling somewhere to have an experience, you're just having the experience and you're able to perceive more of the experience here and now. And I think if I've got this correctly, I believe there have been some brain scans that have been done at the time that people are having near-death experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And the common assumption, which you would have through physicalism, would be that, well, there's a hallucination happening in the brain, and therefore there's more activity. And what they found,
Yeah,
the opposite, there's actually less activity happening in the brain, and yet the
that's
person
right.
having a really profound experience. So how does that all fit in?
It's just really interesting. I'm so fascinated by these neurophysiological studies of near death experiences because it shows a very interesting thing is, there was a major foul up in Western thought, Eesha, at the time of Xenophanes, basically, who figured out that we can think logically about knowledge, and he created the field of epistemology, but he didn't go on to think about the fact that we can think about logically about ignorance too. And so therefore we're in the West, we have difficulty thinking about ignorance. But once you think about ignorance, you see that it too is a very structured phenomenon. And I am interested in how ignorance shapes the discourse about paranormal things. And I don't mean ignorance and I'm not using a value term there, right? I'm just talking about the state. And it's all right sometimes to ignore things in science. Like in a study, you can say, we ignore this factor, right? And that's part of the procedure. And part of their procedure, and now bringing this back to the neurophysiologist on near death experiences, as you probably know, that same phenomenon occurs very, very frequently to people at the bedside of the dying who are not themselves ill or injured. They just happen to be standing there and they say, as grandma died, I got out of my body and I went toward this light, or a light came into the room, or people say, you know, as the guy was dying, I co-experienced his life review and so on. Those are very common things, and they have all of the aspects and the elements of near-death experiences, except they occur not to people who are almost died and returned, but rather who are people who are standing there at the bedside where somebody else dies. But I find that none of, you know, they just totally ignore it. But it's all right for them to do it because their methodology, see, is what they're in love with. I think that's so fascinating. It's like, and by the way, I I am not talking behind anybody's back here because I have some of my dearest and longest friends are parapsychologists, right? And I talk the way I'm talking right now to them too. The fact is, those folks are so naive. They are wonderful, sweet people, but they don't know what they're talking about because in the real world, in 2025, the question of life after death is not a scientific question. And the methodology they use to try to prove it is incoherent. For example, now I don't know anything about mediums, but I know a lot of parapsychologists are interested in mediums. Now, just why do people think that there's something to mediums? Because the medium told me things about my Uncle Willis that he couldn't possibly have known. That is a self-contradiction, isn't it? And I've asked that to many parapsychologists, and they have to admit it's true. But they're so wrapped up in this nonsense, which is all right, that, you know, it's the reality is we are on the verge of genuine rational understanding of the biggest question of existence. But the way we get there is we've got to get rid of the afterlife establishment. Parapsychology is a failed profession. That's the reality. But there's a great new way of doing it. And by the way, I'll send you my book, and I'll ask you to find. I'm sending this book to people because I want them to find holes in it. See, it's being a philosopher is so different. You know, I have never been able to understand folks who want you to who would have put a book out there and want you to slavishly say it's true. When I put a book out there, I want my colleagues to read it line by line and find any kind of error, because if they find an error, that will lead me closer to the truth.
Right.
On the other hand, if they can't find an error, that gives me confidence that I'm on the right path. So I'm putting this out not as an ideology, but as to saying, hey, we can now, there has been a genuine breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death. But parapsychology is going to collapse with this new development, is what I'm saying.
I think that's a very interesting prediction. And
yeah, I can't wait to
curious. I'm just as curious with you
think about the book.
I think
so. Let me know where I can send it to.
I will. I'll definitely reach out to you and give you a mailing address for that. I'd love to read it and respond to you once I've had a read of it as well.
Yeah, that's what I want.
I think what I'm most interested in is so I myself, I'm an experiencer, right? Like, so I have had many experiences that defy even my understanding of science. And I come from a scientific background. I studied engineering, you know, so I went through years of that. So I studied chemistry and physics and all the things.
Me too.
Which is great. But then I got to my mid-20s and then I started
chemistry is just, oh my God. I could have, you know, as soon as I got my chemistry set as a kid, you know, I mean, I could, you can't major in everything, but chemistry is, oh my God, it's so great.
It's fascinating. The only thing is, I got to my mid-20s and I started to experience things in the spiritual realm, and it didn't make
Yeah,
sense. I couldn't find a way to reconcile what I had learned in school versus what I was experiencing in my own
yeah,
life. I think that's where a lot of the discrepancy does come in, is because I mean, of course, I mean, everything you're saying is true. Like NDEs are not being treated scientifically for the most part. And at the same time, you've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people having these experiences. So
that's right.
is that possible? Maybe the
I
science.
know exactly why it's possible, Eesha. I swear to God, it's because of scientism. See, it's like people are not, they want to hear that word scientific, you know? And so it's got to be scientific. That is baloney. The
So
reality is,
what are you bringing in that's going to maybe replace that mindset or replace that framework? Because at the moment, people like myself who have experiences, we don't really have, and I think a lot of people would agree with me on this. There's not a lot out there that helps us to put a frame around the experiences we've had. And if you're anything like me, I've just gone and said, all right, well, I'm going to put my old frameworks to the side and just be
yeah,
open to the idea that there's something outside of that. But I still haven't yet found the exact framework that helps me to make sense even
yeah,
of my
I
own
know.
experience.
And, you are a serious person, Eesha, and I am too. And you got to realize that like I do, that most people who think they're interested in life after death are not really serious people. They want to hear stories. They want to have that glowing look in their eyes, but they don't know what they're talking about. All right. But what the reality is was very well stated by David Hume, who said, and if you follow these words as I say them, you'll see he was right. He said, by the mere light of reason, it seems difficult to prove the immortality of the soul. Now, there is an understatement. And he went on to say, some new species of logic is requisite for that purpose, and some new faculties of the mind that they may enable us to comprehend that logic. All right. Now, if you ever studied the logical positivist movement from the early 20th century, it's A.J. Ayer, for example, but the early 20th century called the logical positivism was, those philosophers realized that the classical statements about life after death were unverifiable. I mean that, and therefore although that we feel good feelings or see images, that there's no real cognitive content to that, and that is the reality. And so the reality means that what we need, if we really are serious about the question of life after death, really serious, I mean, not like the New Agers who just want to hear stories, but if you're really serious about it, then what you need to do is to face that question. But can we have a logic of the unintelligible, a logic of nonsense? Well, because of Aristotle, we think we can't. But Plato kind of thought we could, okay? And like, we got maybe a few more minutes here. Let me show you that you can actually think logically about nonsense, okay? Most people think of nonsense as something unformed, formless, incoherent, right? But now listen to this. I'm going to give you 4 locutions, all right? First, 'twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. Is that nonsense?
I'm not sure I even understood what you
Yeah,
just
well, yeah,
said.
but it is. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. That's nonsense. But
Okay.
listen to this. Holiness breeds the vestigial lipstick of spontaneity. That's nonsense too, but it's different, right? Now listen to this. That cannibal you men just ate was the last one in this county. That's nonsense too, but that's yet a different type. Now listen to this. Hat thoroughly the if will soon alzest. That's nonsense too, but yet a different. But all of those different types of nonsense have a common structural formula, which means that contrary to the common sense view that if this is the level of ordinary meaningful language, nonsense is something down here. That's not correct. Once you think it through, that actually nonsense is a secondary structure on the top of language, and it has a more complicated thing to think it through, which is why in many spiritual uses of nonsense have been emerged. So koans, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? In the Middle Ages, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity was a koan. It was like you were supposed to think of it as a way of meditating on the existence of God. Or today they have glossolalia in the funda Christian groups, uh, talk nonsense syllables until they float away in an ecstatic state. By the way, I've tried it. It really works. You can get yourself very quickly into a very astonishing altered states of consciousness. But my point here is that you now, if I gave you another sentence, you could tell me which one of those four categories it belongs to. If I said, for example, when you do this experiment, if you smell a odorless gas, it's carbon monoxide. You would recognize that as an example of like the cannibal nonsense, right? Well, there's lots and lots of different types of nonsense, and so anyway, we can learn how to think logically about nonsense. It's actually very easy. It's the difficulty is entirely psychological. And I know this because I've taught this constantly to my logic students, and I've gotten, I mean, it finally became an entire semester length course, which I taught multiple times. But I know from my long experience that you can reformat people's minds to think about things that are unintelligible. And when you do, you get a lot of really interesting results. My lectures and seminars I've done on this for years, they are most popular with people in the field of advertising because nonsense makes people pay attention. Or they are attorneys. Attorneys would go to my courses to learn about their critical thinking skills. And once you start thinking about nonsense, you can think on a whole different level that nobody else can. And people, when I taught at one university, the people from the literary department, would come to my lectures. So this is not something that's going to appeal to the New Agers because what they're interested in is stories. But there is a small contingent of folks, as I know from my career as professor of psychology and philosophy, who are really interested in this from a serious point of view. And they are now ready to be satisfied because, this is, I have tested this out with enough people to know. I gave it to 14 of the most brilliant people I know. Professor of an astrophysicist, two professors of business, a couple of logic professors of psychology, and I asked them to find a hole in this, please. Nobody could find it. So I'm confident that we have now a breakthrough in the rational investigation of life after death, but it's not going to go over well with the parapsychologist.
It's a pretty bold statement, and I think to finish up today, what can you say just as some final words for people for people who have had a near-death experience and are maybe looking to find some sort of meaning about that and to find some comfort in the experience they've had?
Oh, I think people naturally do that, don't you? That's where they get great comfort from it, and it changes their lives. And what I would say is this: I would say that where I am on it as a logician, I understand why, at least in 2025, you can't draw an inference that the logical proof that there's an afterlife. But I also know that we're on the verge of it, and there are whole new ways of doing it. And where I am is I understand the logical difficulties, but I give up. I can't think my way out of it. All my life, I've been able to think my way out of anything because that's the way. If you're really serious about knowing something, you need to learn logic and you need to knock down everything you think, or at least try. Because if you keep trying to knock out everything you think, then eventually what you come out with, you're going to have a little more confidence in it. So where I am after 50 something years of thinking about near death experiences, I give up. I can't think of any way out of it. So, I gather there's an afterlife.
Maybe
Yeah,
maybe thinking is not the correct pathway. I mean, maybe we can
that's true too.
maybe
But
feel our way into an understanding. I mean, obviously people who have these experiences don't just think about a near death and have it as a memory. There's a tangible shift that happens for people at a feeling, at a being level, and understanding that changes within them about who we are. And so maybe by getting to this point where you can no longer think about it, maybe that's the starting point of actually being able to understand.
well, that would be the koan. That's the purpose of using a koan, isn't it? Because you try to solve it logically, and when you realize you can't solve it logically, it puts you into a different framework. But see, there's a lot of people who just don't want a proof of life after death, because a person with a near death experience, what they don't need a proof of life after death,
Right.
and religious fanatics don't need a proof of it. They might burn you at the stake for bringing it up, right? But some people do want rational credence toward a afterlife, and I can help them.
I love that. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. It's been such an
Thank you, Eesha. This is great.
conversation. I will look forward to reading your book, and we'll put your website and links in the description. So anyone who wants to check out Dr. Raymond Moody's work, you can go check out his courses, his books, and it's been a fantastic show. So thank you everyone for listening, tuning in, and give us a like, share, and subscribe, and share it with your friends. Get the good word out. First Contact the podcast. We got some amazing guests coming up for you, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.